Well, for me, half of my life wouldn't be my life without Persichetti. First of all, he was entirely responsible for my coming to Juilliard, and he would never take credit for it. He never took credit for anything that he did for students. He would even tell funny stories to get away from it. I found out something like 10 years later that he was the guy who had gone to the president and said, hire this guy. And when I caught him on it, when I asked him about it, he said, no, don't worry about that, no. He was incredible that way. I thought I was the luckiest person in the world after I graduated because I became his TA. And to be his TA is to be in a learning den for twice 365 days. I sat there in that room and watched him teach and kept saying to myself, I want to be you, I want to be you. And one day I went up to him, I was brave enough to go up to him and say, okay, I want to teach. I really want to teach. I know I want to do that in my life. What's your advice? He looked at me for a minute. There was always moments of silence. Then remember, he talked like a machine gun, right? It was, bah, 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 bah. Yeah, and always the gestures with the hands and the legs. Stuff. So I thought, like you, I thought he was not going to say anything. And I started to say something again, and then he interrupted me, and he just said 3 words: learn the literature. So, I went home, and I was thinking about it. Learn the literature, learn the literature. A prelude of Chopin here, a mazurka there, a fugue by Bach, that kind of thing. And I found out the next day, talking to him again, no, he meant the entire literature. The entire literature. You know everything about Bach and Mozart and Chopin and Schumann, and devote your life to it. And he was right. He was absolutely right.
And he knew it.
And he knew it.
Yeah.
He knew the literature.
He knew the literature.
Oh, he knew it.
Right.
And even better, he could sit down on the piano and play it. Any piece that he knew, and he knew hundreds, he could sit down at the piano and do it right in front of you. Somebody was comparing him, I don't remember who they were comparing him to. I always compared him to Mozart. I'm not comparing them as composers, I'm not talking about that at all. But you know the kind of skills that Mozart had. He had those skills, he really did. His memory was incredible.
Yeah, well, there's that story that I love to tell about my first lesson with him. And I was in the Juilliard Lounge, and I think it was Don Ure, composer, came up and he said, "Oh, you're going to have your first lesson with Persichetti." He says, "What are you going to take?" I said, "Well, I'm going to take the beginning of an orchestra piece." He says, "You're going to get to hear your orchestra piece, lucky you." And I'm thinking, like, well, what does he mean by this?
Yeah.
So I bring it in, and it was a stupid piece, really. It starts with 2 muted trumpets, and then it's like grows into this monster kind of thing. And so he starts out, playing the 2 muted trumpets, and then keeps going, and I'm thinking, okay, well, he's going to stop at a certain point in time. Well, then he starts grabbing other things here, and then when he can no longer fit anything under his fingers, he says, "Horns! I hear the horns!" and then the percussion comes in, and he goes, like that was just, and I really did hear the orchestra piece that day. Really,
And he had never seen that piece before in his life. This is all the first time.
I was just amazed to watch him do this, reviewing submissions to Presser, that I saw him do this with music for concert band.
So would you just step back and tell everyone what he did?
What he did.
Yeah.
Before Elkin Vogel was affiliated with Presser, or owned by Presser, which is around 1970 or so, Vincent was running Elkin Vogel. So when Presser bought Elkin Vogel, Vincent came along with it. I'm not sure how directly involved he was, but I know that he had quite a lot to do with what was accepted for publication. I overlapped with him between 1985, I began full-time, and a few years before that, up until the last few weeks of his life. And
Which was?
87, yeah, the middle of 87. And he went to work pretty close to the end. And so I would often be with him reviewing submissions or discussing them, but sometimes he would play through what came in. So I saw him read through a very complicated, harmonically and rhythmically and contrapuntally score for wind ensemble, where just about everybody was a transposing instrument in all different transpositions. Now, I wouldn't have known if he made a wrong note, but it had the sound of being done correctly. And he turned to me and said, "This guy sent in the same piece about 6 or 7 years ago in a different key." in a different key. You know, he remembered the differences. Not only that it was familiar, but that the details. And it is frightening. You know, they say you talk about Mozart, that Glassenoff. To what extent the stories are, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that Glassenoff, it drove him to drink because he just remembered everything. And those of you who studied with him, didn't he play back? Like, didn't you write this last year? Or, you know, he would remember everything that he did.
On that same subject, people who were students of his before, used to come back, you know, to see him. And some would come back 30 or 35 years after. He would remember the pieces that those people wrote and even sing it to them. I love your string quartet. The kid was 18 years old when he wrote it. Now he's 40 years old. He remembered it. And how many hundreds of students did he have? What a mind that was.
Yeah, one of the stories when I was a student was that student brought in a 2-page song, and Persichetti just took it from him, looked at it. Nice song. He says, why don't you write another one? And the student says, well, why don't you play through? Aren't you going to play through it? And he said, sure. And he was holding the music himself, and not looking at the music, but he was just playing it from having memorized it. Sure, I'll play it.
You know, I was also, I was his student. It's kind of interesting to me, the span of time that we have here. I was his student 76 to 81. Even how I got to study with him was an interesting story, which I won't go into now, but I was his assistant from 77 to 79. And what he would very often do is he'd start playing a piece, maybe it was a piece that the orchestra was playing that week or something, and the music would modulate, and he'd start playing another piece that picked up in that key, and he'd take that piece till it modulated, then he'd pick up another piece, and it just would go on and on. It was unbelievable that he had the music in his head, and that he also was sort of doing the analysis and knowing where he was. I was recently given a copy of something very precious to me called Magic Chain, The Magic Chain. There's a copy of it at Presser as well. In that, he writes 207 pieces of all different time periods, all different styles, and he connects in the magic chain from one piece to the next, just as he used to do instantly in class. And it's incredible because he wrote out all 207 titles, and then he wrote the music that connected it all.
And
So
he
he just
did all this without computers.
just with a mind like an encyclopedia.
But Vincent told me once, when he was a kid, he loved Haydn so much he just studied all the baritone trios. Baritone was like it was a sort of a tenor cello, sort of. And so he knew that these trios for baritone, was it viola and regular cello or violin? But he studied them, and when you're a prodigy and you're just studying everything, you don't have people to correct you. You just absorb it in your imagination. So he envisioned that Haydn was writing all these pieces for euphonium in 2 strings. And one of the serenades is for euphonium and low strings. And he thought at that time that he was copying Haydn's idea.
Reasonable error.